On March 28, 1979, the most significant commercial nuclear power accident in US history to date occurred at the 3 Mile Island power plant at Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, and resulted in a partial meltdown of the number 2 reactor core and the release of some radioactive coolant and gas. The accident occurred just 12 days after the release of the US thriller The China Syndrome about a potential meltdown at a nuclear power plant, and which only heightened the concern when the 3 Mile Island incident occurred and increased the calls to halt nuclear power in the US. 42 years on, and we are in a situation where nuclear power will be required to fill in the gaps as our reliance on renewables increases and fossil fuels such as gas and coal are reduced. But what happened to 3 Mile Island, and how will it affect us in the future? This video is sponsored by REN. Although nuclear will be part of the power mix in the future as fossil fuels are reduced, there are other ways to help lock carbon back up in natural, environmentally friendly ways. REN is a public benefit company similar to crowdfunding, but one that supports projects that fight climate change and lets you make a difference in the climate crisis. Ren.co is a website that asks you a few questions about your lifestyle to calculate your carbon footprint and shows how you can reduce it by supporting carbon reduction projects. One of the projects is biochar in California. This helps prevent the devastating wildfires we have seen recently, which also release large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere by removing the dead and flammable trees from California's old-growth forests. Instead of letting them burn, fueling wildfires, biochar effectively removes them and then cooks them at high temperatures in a low to zero oxygen environment, turning them into charcoal, which keeps the carbon locked up for thousands of years. This is then mixed with compost and sold to local farmers as a natural fertilizer. There are many other projects as well, from mineral weathering in Scotland to boost forest growth to community tree planting in Africa. All you need to do to help is to click on the link in description to offset your carbon footprint on ren.co, and the first 100 people to sign up will have an extra 10 trees planted in their name. From 1963 to 1979, the number of nuclear power plants built globally almost doubled every year. The nuclear age of the 1950s and 60s promised power too cheap to meter, and as a result, nuclear power in the 70s was going through a boom time. 3 Mile Island was one of these new nuclear power stations. It had 2 pressurized water reactors, TMI-1, an 800 megawatt reactor going online in 1974, and TMI-2, a 906 megawatt reactor in 1978. TMI-1 was at the time and up until 2019 one of the best performing units in the US. At the time of the accident in 1979, TMI-2 in terms of age was almost brand new. So what happened to cause its failure? At 4 a.m. on the 28th of March 1979, TMI-2 was working at 97% capacity when a minor malfunction in the secondary cooling circuit caused the temperature of the primary cooling circuit to rise. Within 1 second, this triggered an automatic reactor shutdown, but unbeknownst to the operators, a relief valve stuck open and was not shown by the instrumentation. This allowed most of the coolant from the reactor core to drain away, and even though the reactor was shut down, it was still very hot, and without the pressurized coolant, the core suffered a partial meltdown. That is the simplified version, but in reality things were a bit more complicated, with systems design and human error as much to blame as the initial mechanical fault. As the relief valve stuck open, water surged into the pressurizer, a tank that is part of the primary cooling circuit. The operators, acting on their training, which told them that the level in this tank was the only reliable measure of water in the whole system, saw the rise in the levels of the pressurizer tank and reduced the flow, thinking that the system might rupture through having too much water in it. Steam formed in the primary circuit, which was then pumped around the system, causing the pumps to vibrate violently, and thinking the system was full anyway, they turned off the pumps. This stopped the flow of water, which because of its low level then boiled away, causing the fuel rods to be exposed and heat up, releasing radioactive material into what water was left. At 6:22 a.m., 2 hours 22 minutes after the reactor had shut down, the operators closed a block valve and stopped the loss of water from the primary circuit, but by then superheated steam and gases were blocking the flow of coolant water. Throughout the day, they tried to force more water into the system to condense and collapse the steam bubbles, and were eventually able to restart one of the pumps. There was a buildup of hydrogen gas when the zircaloy metal tubes holding the nuclear fuel pellets were exposed, and a high-temperature reaction with the remaining water occurred. Shortly afterwards, there was a limited hydrogen burn, but there wasn't enough oxygen in the system to cause an explosion. The remainder of the unburnt hydrogen was gradually released over a period of time. On the 29th and 30th of March, the operators, using a system of pipes and compressors, removed the remainder of the unburnt hydrogen and other gases to a decay tank. All the radionuclides, except some noble gases, including krypton, had been removed by the filters, and this was also released into the atmosphere. But because of its short half-life and being biologically inert, these didn't pose a health hazard. After a month of careful control and settling the reactor down, they eventually established a natural convection circulation where the reactor was said to be in a cold shutdown state, with the coolant water being at under 100 degrees Celsius and at atmospheric pressure. In the subsequent investigation, it was shown that there was insufficient instrumentation to tell the operators what was going on, and some of the ones that were important to them making the correct decisions in the heat of the moment were in places out of sight or even behind control panels. The operators also followed a book of procedures that seemed to best fit the events they saw, but without going through a yes-no checklist. And with the missing instrument information, many of the actions they took were incorrect and made matters worse. It wasn't until July 1984, over 5 years later, when the head of the reactor was removed and the damage was seen firsthand. Over 45% of the core, about 62 tons of material, had melted, with 19 tons reaching the lower part of the reactor head pressure vessel, but wasn't seriously damaged. The cleanup, which started in 1979, was also equally long-winded and very complicated and expensive. It took almost 12 years, ending in 1991, cost nearly $1 billion, and was carried out by over 1,000 skilled workers. Shortly after the start of the cleanup, all connections to the TMI-1 reactor were severed. At the time of the incident, TMI-1 reactor was shut down for refueling, and it stayed that way until 1985. All the plant surfaces had to be decontaminated, and the 10.6 million litres of water used had to be stored and then ultimately evaporated. Approximately 100 tonnes of damaged uranium fuel rods had to be removed and processed, and the remainder stored in concrete, and the whole reactor defueled. Today, TMI-2 reactor is in long-term monitored storage. Although over a third of the fuel in the reactor melted, there was no China syndrome, and the containment building worked as designed. There was a limited release of some radioactivity, but with little to no health hazards. This was confirmed by the thousands of samples and measurements that were taken during and after the accident. Now, whilst the damage to the reactor might not have been as bad as first thought, the nuclear industry itself was badly damaged by the 3 Mile Island incident, which saw a sharp decline in the 80s and 90s. Much of this was down to the sense of panic that ensued, with poor communications between the power company and the Department of Energy, and between state and federal agencies and the media, which drove a policy based on what they thought could happen when they didn't actually know the status of the plant. The partial hydrogen burn, which was indicated by a rapid pressure rise, led to those in the government agencies in charge to think there could be a hydrogen explosion like those that occurred in Fukushima in 2011, and there could be a meltdown that would breach the containment building, the so-called China syndrome. Both of these scenarios were proved incorrect in 1984 when the access was finally gained to the core. That and the mixed messaging from the media only fueled the sense of panic, but in the end the damage was nowhere near on the scale of Fukushima, and Chernobyl was just a whole different story. More than a dozen major studies have been carried out since the incident at 3 Mile Island on the people living in the area around it and the environment, and none found any adverse effects such as increased numbers of cancers beyond the initial stress of the incident itself. What it did bring about was a much greater emphasis on training for when things go wrong and keeping the cooling systems working no matter what the cause of the incident. This and better instrumentation, not just in the US but in the rest of the world, made nuclear safer overall. The number of significant incidents decreased from 2.38 per reactor unit in 1985 to 0.1 by the end of 1997. Fukushima, on the other hand, wasn't a failure of the reactor, which was a US design, but a failure of planning by allowing the placement of the backup generators on ground level behind a seawall when the tsunami hit. In 2019, 3 Mile Island was shut down completely 10 years ahead of when it was expected due to the commercial pressure from cheap gas. But as we've seen, that situation won't last forever, and until we have a worldwide 24/7 renewables that are not ones that just rely upon the sun shining and the wind blowing, like it or not, nuclear will be our fallback. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please thumbs up, subscribe and share, and please don't forget that Patreon supporters get ad-free versions of the videos before they're released on YouTube.